Roger Stone here. Your dollars are losing ground, but gold isn't. American Sovereign Bullion helps you protect your wealth through real, tangible assets. Through their nationwide wholesaler network, you get some of the best pricing on gold and silver delivered straight to your door. Since 1912, the U.S. dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. Meanwhile, gold continues to prove its strength. So call 844-272-2428. That's 844-272-2428. Or visit dyingdollar.com to request your free gold and silver guide. That's dyingdollar.com.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Breaking news.
And I'm Jake Novak in for Roger Stone again. And you were tuning in last night. I was reading off the results minute by minute as they were coming in from that Virginia redistricting referendum. Eventually, by the end of the program, we got the AP call that by a very narrow margin, the people voted in favor of that redistricting won that referendum. Well, the breaking news now is that this evening, a Virginia circuit court, so this is a Virginia state court, has slapped an injunction on the whole process because there is a credible argument against the referendum, not the result, but the way that the referendum was rushed before the voters. This is the real deal. They will not be able to go ahead with redistricting and doing this until the courts have gone through this. This will go to the state Supreme Court of Virginia soon enough. It's possible that it will be upheld in the end. We'll see. But one would hope that the justices on the Supreme Court of the state of Virginia would see what this is, how unjust this is, how crazy this is, and will stop this because, look, there's nothing wrong with winning and losing an election, and there's always going to be some kind of a stacked deck, a news event, some campaign that is able to capture the public's attention, sometimes unjustly so. Things like that are all part of the game. But the stacking of the deck like this with these crazy redistrictings is just annoying. And by the way, for those of you who have been talking about, well, how can we fix this? I've heard some talk radio hosts today talk about maybe letting AI choose the districts so that it's completely unbiased. But, AI is programmed by biased humans, and there's already been a lot of examples of AI bias because that's who's programming it in there. So I don't know if that'll work. But I do have a solution to this, especially if we hold these people to already what their professional level is, their professional standards are. It's very obvious to me who should be in charge of deciding what congressional districts are, where they begin, where they end, et cetera, because there's one group of people in this country who really know neighborhoods better than anybody else. They know where a real neighborhood begins. Like I said, they know where they end. They know the kind of people who are living in there. They kind of know all the income. Realtors. Realtors know what neighborhoods are where and all that stuff. And it's really a big part of their business. And they would be a great group to go to in every state and decide where congressional districts are. I'm really not kidding. They're very good at this. Now, I'm not talking about every realtor who just got into the business and is in and out. I'm talking about the top realtors in every state. And we know who they are because they're constantly telling us, and there's statistics to prove it. So absolutely. Absolutely. I would love for that to be the case. So that's the breaking news. The Virginia thing's put on hold. It may end up going through. And it would be incredible. It would put Virginia from 6-5 Democrat to Republican districts to 10-1 Democrat to Republican, which is just outrageous. It's just getting so crazy now. And both parties are doing it. I get it. It is just so abusive to the election process. And that's the last thing we need in America is fewer people trusting election integrity. And right now, I got to side with the people who are just doubting the integrity of our elections. I mean, how can you not? You've got this mail-in ballot nonsense, which not only is susceptible to fraud, but mail-in ballots are not secret ballots. This is an objective truth. I don't know who's looking over you when you're filling out the ballot. How do I know that an abusive husband isn't threatening to beat his wife when she fills out the mail-in ballot? How do I know it's not the other way around? How do I know that it's how it's being handled properly when you drop it in your mailbox? How do I know that the person whose name is on that ballot actually felt? We don't. This is not a secret ballot. And I learned in 5th grade, I hope you did, that if you don't have a secret ballot, it's not a legitimate election. And the examples they used to use to explain this to us in elementary school were the elections that used to take place in the Deep South after Reconstruction. You know, they used to have a ballot box for the people who were voting for the Democrat and the ballot box if you were voting for the Republican. And people would often vote at work. And your boss would overlook and to see where you dropped that ballot. And if you dropped it in the wrong box, you got fired or you got your head beat in. And that was all I needed to hear about why we need to have secret ballots and why elections that don't have 100% secret ballots are not legitimate. And before you get on me about absentee ballots for our servicemen and women overseas, I got the solution for that too. It's called a secure laptop in a private room where our servicemen and women in forward areas can vote. And for those who are actually fighting in a battle in a war right now, casting their ballot is not on the top of their priority. Living is their top priority. Okay, we're not going to worry about that right now. So again, election integrity right now is just at a low ebb in this country, and I agree with it. I agree with that sentiment. I'm sorry, I really have very little faith in our elections right now, and this redistricting thing is just another blow to this. And it's really dangerous to do this. This is really playing with fire. And all I can say is the last thing we need is millions more Americans not really trusting the whole process, because eventually we're going to start seeing a massive drop in people showing up for elections. And then we're really in trouble. So that is your breaking news right now. But, you know, to me, the top story in the country, not just because it's very explosive in its details, but also because it's another major commentary on where our culture is and where our ethos is now as a society and how mixed up we've become, and that is this SPLC story. To me, this is absolutely sad beyond words that we have solid evidence now that the Southern Poverty Law Center, which many decades ago played a great role in breaking up the modern KKK, has for a long time become an incredibly dangerous left-wing activist group, and that was bad enough. But now we have evidence in the form of wire transfers, in the form of other financial receipts, that the SPLC was funding these far-right groups, including the people who organized the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, including KKK groups, including neo-Nazi groups, simply so they could claim that there was a rise in this kind of white supremacist nonsense in America, so they could be the heroes to supposedly fight it. It is such a sickening situation. And before you fall for the mainstream media or the Democrat Party narrative on this, that this is all just trumped up by the DOJ and the Trump administration, et cetera, I want you to remember what Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche had to say about this yesterday. Listen to this.
I just want to make sure I understand. You're alleging that the Southern Poverty Law Center was paying the leaders of KKK and other groups to continue their operations? Is that?
I'm not alleging it. The grand jury returned an indictment that says that. And so what the investigation found, according to the indictment that was returned today, is that they were paying. So the Southern Poverty Law Center is raising money, asking folks to give them money to dismantle racism. And over a very long period of time, they were using some of the money they raised from donors to pay to, they called them field, basically to informants, for information, for access, to just pay them for certain to do certain things, and so yes, that's exactly what the indictment charges.
Yeah, and it wasn't just for information and to infiltrate. That's what the SPLC is probably going to argue at some point once they get through the whole procedure. First, they'll fight this on procedural grounds and say they had no right to investigate us. That'll go on for a while, but then they'll eventually have to defend themselves and they'll say, no, we were just paying off informants, but the financial evidence proves otherwise. They were paying people to help organize and commit hate acts. Now, beyond the obvious outrage on the surface of this about this, and this really makes me just incredibly sad. I know that there's a lot of my fellow conservatives who are happy about this because it exposes the SPLC, and I get it. I am glad that the evidence is there, don't get me wrong. But there's nothing good about this story. This says so many things that are bad about where our country has gone. And it's also told us something else, which is one of the biggest threats to this country, which is we've gone from a country where people aspire to be heroes to a country where people aspire to be victims. We've made victimhood now better than being a hero. So if the SPLC can create more victims make themselves victims as well, that's more desirable in the minds of millions of Americans than to actually be the hero. Victims get this top of the totem pole type status for millions of Americans, and it's really dangerous. I mean, this leads to almost a suicidal type of ethos in this country. I would rather have 1 million people pretending to be a hero than 1 million people trying to make themselves victims any day of the week, because I embrace life. And I embrace all those positive things. And even if we're stretching a little to call ourselves a hero, fine. But to me, that's the core, the most scary thing about all of this. Not the incredible lengths that this group was willing to go to smear Trump supporters and smear millions of Americans, no matter how they voted. That's ugly enough, and it is very ugly. And I do believe that people who fake hate crimes should get a minimum of 10 years in prison for doing that. And I do believe that people who organize hate crimes and then pretend that they're the victims of them should get life imprisonment. I really do. So I'm not going away from that type of a thought, but to me, the saddest part of this is we have a nation now that believes that victimhood and proving that you're a victim is more important than proving that you're a hero or just a good person. That's scary because there's no good ending to that. What if everyone's successful at that? We're all victims? We all end up dead? We all end up wounded forever? That's not a really great growth industry as far as living and surviving. It's really, really depressing. All right, when we come back, I'll get some of the updates for you on the Iran war and a little bit more. I'm Jake Novak in for Roger Stone, and Roger Stone's going to be calling in again at the bottom of the hour, so don't forget to miss that. Do not miss that. I should say, don't forget to not miss that. I'll be right back.
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
Roger Stone, who's a very, one of the smartest political minds. Roger Stone was persecuted. People forget he's actually a brilliant political analyst.
Now, get in the zone. It's the Stone Zone. Here's Roger Stone.
And I'm Jake Novak filling in for Roger Stone, but we're expecting Roger to call in about 10 minutes from now, so of course stay tuned for that. I want to get you updated a little bit on what's going on with the Iran situation, and as usual, because I trust the people with skin in the game, not that they're getting it right or wrong, but just that they're the ones who are telling me what they think, and they really aren't hiding their cards, and that's why I look at Wall Street's numbers very often when it comes to things like this, because again, they have the money on the table right now. Not saying they're better. I'm not saying they're always smarter. Sometimes they are. But the fact is, they've got their money on the table, and it's been so obvious to me for the last several days, bless their hearts, that they've basically been saying with their money, they have no idea what's happening next in Iran. They've kind of thrown in the towel, and that's because they're up one day, they're down the next. Now, for the last 3 weeks, we've had strong gains, which tells me that while the investors don't know exactly how it's going to end, they've accepted now, after 7 or 8 weeks of the war, that the worst predictions are not going to happen, are not going to come to pass. We're not seeing, thank God, a lot of people dying. Actually, really anybody dying. We're seeing a good number of these IRGC fighters dying and military folks, but there's been no significant civilian death in Iran at all of any kind. We haven't really heard any reports or numbers, and they would gin them up if they had something to go with, but they don't. And thank God we're still at that number 13, that unlucky number 13 of American servicemen and women who have been killed in this war so far. Again, even one life is too many. I really hate that even one person died. But I mean, 8 weeks of this kind of massive war. And I know we've had a ceasefire for 2 weeks, but still, and only 13 have died. It's quite extraordinary. And has a lot to do with the morality of our armed forces right now and the Israeli armed forces. And it also has to do with technological improvements. But Wall Street doesn't know exactly how it's going to end. They're just betting. They've just decided to put their money down recently that it's just not going to be the worst thing. So today we had a big rally on the markets. I mean, not a big rally percentage points wise, but we had more than a 300-point gain on the Dow. But as I look at futures for tomorrow, they're down about 250. So they're going back and forth, folks. And that's understandable because there's a lot of confusion right now. And confusion among your enemies is a good thing. Read Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I urge you all to do that because it's clear that Iran is confused. It's confused about who really is in charge. There's all kinds of questions about that, and we can't even really have peace talks with them right now because who would actually show up and whether they would really represent the Iranian people and government is hard to discern at this moment. And that's okay. We want our enemies to be confused. We don't want them pressing a nuclear button, but they don't have one, thank goodness. And that's, of course, because of the efforts of the United States and Israel over many years, not just since last June. And that's great. But it does mean that we don't exactly know what's going to happen next. It does mean that we're going to get all kinds of crazy reports here and there, but it also means that most of the mainstream media, which continues to talk about this war like it's been a terrible failure, are continuing to really just embarrass themselves. 13 dead, no significant civilian deaths, a completely confused Iranian regime, and this is a nation that's been preparing for war and only war and conducting wars for 47 years, and this is what they have to show for it. This is not a failure, folks. It just isn't. Oh, gas prices have gone up. Well, actually, they started to come down. This morning, according to AAA, we were at $4.02 national average for a gallon of gas. Not a great number, but well below the $5, well over $5 we were at in 2022 at one point, and 14 cents down from the high just a couple of weeks ago. We are trending lower on gasoline prices. Will it get back below $4 nationally? I don't know. Probably. And I think it'll go down real fast once the war is clearly over. But folks, this is not anything to be sad about now. You want to be worried about outcomes? That's fine. But to believe that we're losing, to believe this is a terrible thing, to believe, oh, the Iranians are confused, they've changed so good. Let them be confused. That's the point. You want them to be coherent and sly and calculating? I don't. That doesn't make any sense. That's not what we're looking for here. This is all on top of the fact that it looks like, and I hope this is true, according to President Trump, that these women who were scheduled to be executed any day now in Iran simply for protesting or asserting their rights will not be executed now. Now, I don't know. If I were these women, I would try to get out of the country anyway, even if they've been released. But hey, that's a positive development. I certainly hope that that's true and we move forward on that one. I mean, honestly, folks, can't we just look at the real numbers here and realize that the score is 126-1 in the U.S.'s favor? Let's hope it stays that way. Roger Stone will join us next on the Stone Zone. I'm Jake Novak. Thanks for joining us.
This is the Stone Zone. Now, get in the zone. It's the Stone Zone.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone. Where's Roger Stone?
Here's Roger Stone.
And it truly is about to become the Stone Zone again. I'm Jake Novak filling in for Roger Stone, but Roger is calling in again for our second half hour here. And Roger, I have to ask you, I really believe that this SPLC indictment thing is the biggest story for a lot of reasons. Also, I'm giving people the update on the redistricting in Virginia and the Iran war. Are those your top three as well tonight?
That, plus, of course, the historic announcement that President Donald Trump will reschedule marijuana, cannabis, which has enormous implications for those who use cannabis for medicinal purposes, and I think has an enormous appeal to younger voters, libertarian voters, and so on. This has been a long time coming. I've been a long time advocate for descheduling. I'm a firm believer that cannabis is not nearly as dangerous as alcohol.
That's for sure. That's always the comeback when people talk about the dangers of marijuana. But, obviously a lot of states have already moved in this direction. Can you explain to our viewers why the federal rescheduling of it is so important?
Certainly. I mean, at this point, almost 40 states have legalized cannabis, most of them for medicinal purposes, with substantial restrictions, some for recreational purposes. But right now, under the federal schedule, marijuana is on the same level as heroin, for example, which makes very little sense. It's important to recognize that when Richard Nixon launched the war on drugs, he was focused on drug kingpins, drug traffickers, major narco operators. It was Bill Clinton who signed the 1994 crime bill. That was written by Senate Judiciary Chairman Joe Biden that decided to target the individual users of illegal drugs and actually put in place the mandatory sentences for first-time nonviolent crime of possession of, for example, a small amount of marijuana. So let's say you have a single mother of three working, 2 jobs to make ends meet. She's caught with a small amount of marijuana in her purse. A 15-year sentence to me seems unreasonable. A judge should be able to see whether she has any priors, see what her domestic situation is, and come up with an appropriate sentence if it's legal at all. Now, federally, today, possession or moving marijuana across the state line is still a federal crime. And it's really time to bring the federal law in line with state laws. So, for example, in Florida, medicinal marijuana is legal. Now, you have to go get a state-approved card to be able to buy it. You have to submit some health information, and it's limited to the treatment of very specific diseases or maladies. I frankly think that list should be broadened. So, for example, if you have a lower back pain, you would not be entitled to get medicinal marijuana. Who's most opposed to the legalization or the deregulation? Why, it's big pharma. You see, they want to get you hooked on OxyContin or other opioids, which are far more dangerous than either alcohol or cannabis.
I'm glad you mentioned President Nixon. Of course, you are one of the foremost experts on his presidency. I urge people, in addition to following some of the things that Roger's written about President Nixon and the war on drugs, also read The Fix by Michael Massing, because that was a book that came out a few years after that Clinton-Joe Biden shift on drug enforcement. And a huge amount of that book was dedicated to explaining how the Nixon anti-drug policy, in addition to the big kingpin stuff that you talked about, but the methadone clinics that were around the country that were so denigrated, they actually worked, Roger. They worked, and it was born out of Richard Nixon's concern for returning Vietnam veterans coming home from the war who had gotten hooked on heroin. It was all in the right place, and they did make a good difference, didn't they?
They really did. That's a terrific book. I have read it. Look, Richard Nixon was an amazingly progressive president. He doesn't really get credit for many of his key accomplishments. It was Richard Nixon, of course, who ended the war in Vietnam far ahead of the schedule that was preferred by the Pentagon. Richard Nixon, who reached a strategic arms limitation agreement with the Russians, which everybody predicted he could not do. Richard Nixon, who opened the door to China at a time that China was a dirt-poor, backwards agrarian society. Most people didn't have indoor plumbing, didn't have toilets. Most areas of the country didn't have electricity, certainly the rural areas. It wasn't until Bill Clinton gave the Chinese most favored nation trading status, and of course the Bushes, George W. Bush, expanded that. That's what made China the superpower and the dangerous enemy that they are today. It was Richard Nixon who desegregated the public schools. When Nixon became president, only 22% of public schools across the country had been desegregated. By the time he left office, that number was 87%. That's without any violence or bloodshed, but very aggressive legal actions by John Mitchell's Department of Justice. It was also Richard Nixon who launched the war on drugs, but as I point out, the war on drugs was more focused on traffickers and kingpins. What was Richard Nixon, who, of course, gave us the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, if he were to see how we're over-regulating environmentally today, I think Nixon would be rolling in his grave. But we have to recognize that there are individuals who will despoil the air and the water in order to make money. So, like Theodore Roosevelt, Nixon was a conservationist, and he gave us the EPA, for example. I've always marveled at those who go on and on about the Southern strategy. You have to recognize in 1968, Richard Nixon had Hubert Humphrey running to his left and George Wallace running to his right. He had a perfect civil rights record. Nixon as the vice president, rounded up the final votes necessary for the passage of the 1958 Civil Rights Act, which is the first and only major piece of civil rights legislation to pass since the Civil War. In the background, thwarting that, was arch segregationist Lyndon Baines Johnson, who wrote the Southern Manifesto, signed by every Southern senator except for Johnson, who was planning a 1960 presidential run. And they needed Republican votes in order to pass it. Nixon was lauded by Dr. Martin Luther King for being the engineer of the passage of that law. Nixon, of course, also gave us affirmative action. Now, many of my conservative friends don't like affirmative action, but it is definitively a civil rights program. Nixon, who quadrupled the funding for black colleges, for example. So I don't really understand those who criticize Nixon's Southern strategy. Nixon appointed more African Americans to federal office than Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy combined.
Well, I understand it. They're ignoramuses. I mean, that's usually the easiest answer. But, you know, in that litany of bullet points that you just rattled off so well for us, Roger, boy, this sounds familiar. So many of President Trump's policies have been really what we would always consider to be moderate to really even a little bit to the left. And which is why maybe these No Kings rallies, every time people try to interview people there, they can't think of any issue because Trump's kind of stolen the issues. I know, and there's another book about Richard Nixon that goes into that. Doug Schoen's book. The whole book is about how Nixon stole some of these issues because they were the right thing to do from the left. And so in 1972, there was really no strong argument against him other than personality, and he won in a crazy landslide.
Yeah, it really is quite extraordinary. Just yesterday, I was in the Oval Office with the president for several hours, and at my very last, the president says, "What's your agenda?" And we went through a number of items, and while we were there, Secretary of State Marco Rubio joined us, and I said, "Mr. President, I have one more request." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Before the end of your term, that oil portrait right there, Franklin Roosevelt, that needs to come down, and Dick Nixon needs to go back in place." And the president said, "That's a great idea. Have you seen where Nixon's portrait is? They've got it here kind of on a back staircase." Then he shouted to one of his aides, "I want Nixon moved to a better place outside the Oval Office." And he said to his very able assistant, Natalie, "Find out what the inventory is from the National Archives of oil portraits of Richard Nixon." So sounds to me like Nixon may be returning to the Oval Office here shortly.
Yeah, that would be an interesting. Of course, the left will go crazy about that and turn it into.
That was the best thing. Trump said, the lefties will go crazy.
But there are so many things like this. We really have. We talked about this last night. The reinvention of the Republican Party to more of a progressive party. I wouldn't say progressive, a populist party, just more of a common sense party. This was the problem. If you might remember, there was a book years ago written, I forgot who wrote it, called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And this was this Democrat liberal argument that, boy, these people who live in Kansas, they should be Democrats. Why aren't they Democrats? Because, our party is the party of the little guy, and Kansas has this, that, and the other thing. And now maybe we should write books like what's the matter with California? What's the matter with all these states that continue to vote for Democrats when it's been the Republicans, both in their state and nationally, who have done best by them?
Yeah, the Democrats are really out of control. I was outraged today to watch Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's a complete and total phony. I mean, she's funded by banks and big pharma, millions of dollars of contributions. I remember when she was running for president, very briefly, she made a video where she said, "I'm going to go get me a beer." Please, lady. I mean,
that was a stretch.
You're Ivy League educated. You're completely owned by big pharma and the big banks. She's a sock puppet. And she attempted to attack Kevin Warsh, who is the president's great new nominee to be chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Now, unfortunately, Warsh cannot take office, even if confirmed by the Senate, because Tom Tillis, who is staying on the U.S. Senate, Republican of North Carolina, soon to be retiring because he knows if he ran again, he would be ignominiously defeated by a MAGA candidate. But Tillis refuses to vote for Warsh until Jeanine Pirro, who appeared on these very airwaves for years, drops the investigation into Jerome Too Late Powell, the current Federal Reserve Board chairman, who very clearly lied under oath to Congress about the opulent $1.6 billion plan to redo the already opulent Federal Reserve headquarters on Constitution Avenue. I mean, it's already a palace, but Powell, under questioning, said, no, there's no private dining room for the governors. There's no private elevator for the board governors. There's no roof garden for the board governors. Those were all material lies. That's not true. We've seen the publicly published plan. Now, whether it rises to the level of prosecution, hard to say. I mean, they charged me for lying to Congress when no comment I made that was inaccurate was material. In other words, in order to violate the False Statements Act, your statement must first be willful, and then secondarily must be material. Which, of course, I did make misstatements in my sworn testimony, but they were neither willful nor were they material, meaning there was no Russian collusion to cover up. So what would be my motive to lie? The judge in my case, Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who might as well have been an extra prosecutor because she ruled against my prosecution team in every matter, said to me at sentencing, "You have been convicted of lying to cover up for Donald Trump." To which I say at this moment, cover up what? The Russian collusion that didn't exist?
That I have actually a soundbite of Sarah Eisen, my former colleague at CNBC. You're going to love this if you haven't heard it. Grilling Elizabeth Warren today. Listen to this.
I did want to ask you, Senator Warren, about something else that happened last weekend, which is you campaigned with Graham Plattner, who is ahead of that state's very pivotal Democratic primary. And I wanted to ask you about something you said. You said he's the kind of man. And I've interviewed you for a long time and watched your hearings and listened to your questions. You care about character. This is a guy that had a chest tattoo with a Nazi symbol. Okay, he apologized for it. It's a guy that reportedly wrote that people concerned about rape should take some responsibility for themselves and not get so effed up that they wind up having sex with someone they don't mean to. He praised military tactics used by Hamas, reportedly, in comments online and Reddit when they were murdering Israeli soldiers. So I'm just curious why you think he's your kind of man.
So, as you rightly point out, he has apologized. He's out meeting with the people of Maine every single day.
He only apologized about the tattoo. I mean, she got nailed on that one. She had nothing to say other than he's meeting with people of Maine. Big deal. So is the dog catcher.
She's an elitist phony owned by big banks and big pharma, and she should stop trying to act like a regular person because there's nothing regular about her. She's a multi-millionaire, Ivy League educated, so maybe she should go get her a beer, as they say.
I mean, it's just amazing how if you're against Trump, they'll excuse anything. I mean, it's the level of this insanity has just gotten to the point where it's no longer a joke. I mean, some people say, well, this is really funny. Isn't it funny that Elizabeth Warren is supporting a guy with a Nazi tattoo who basically says rape victims had it coming and loves the fact that Hamas is killing civilians? Sarah made a mistake there. She said it's soldiers. They were killing civilians. They were killing babies. I mean, there's just no level of this. This seems to me like a tremendous level of we're in a real danger zone, aren't we?
We really are, but I also I believe that if we're going to expel, for example, Eric Swalwell, who turns out to be a complete and total degenerate, from the House, then we must also expel Corey Mills, the Republican from Florida. I mean, Corey Mills lied about his military service, lied about his efforts to extract people from Afghanistan and Iran, and he lied to the President of the United States. He has a restraining order filed against him for beating up one of his girlfriends. He beat up a second girlfriend. I mean, this guy is a freak. And we have to have one standard. If we're going to expel Eric Swalwell, who was rightfully expelled, plus I think he's getting his style and fashion tips from Steve Bannon at this point. But if we're going to expel him, then we should also expel one of our own, Corey Mills, who turns out to be a weirdo. I wrote a very, very long piece on this, which you can find online. I think we have to make sure our own house is in order. I will tell you this: it's a Republican district, but it's a narrowly Republican district. If he is the Republican nominee in that seat, we will lose that seat to the Democrats in an election which we cannot afford to lose any seats.
All right, Roger, stick with this. We're just going to take a break and come back with you. But again, I want to commend you. I was going to mention Bannon. Now you're talking about Mill. This is the kind of higher moral stance we have to take. We have to call out our own, and you've done that on a number of occasions. I appreciate that. One more segment with Roger Stone here on the Stone Zone. I'm Jake Novak. We'll be right back.
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
It is a great, great person, Roger Stone.
The Stone Zone. This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
Roger Stone, who's a very, one of the smartest political minds. Roger Stone was persecuted. People forget he's actually a brilliant political analyst.
Now, get in the zone. It's the Stone Zone. Here's Roger Stone.
And Roger Stone is joining us now. I'm Jake Novak here at the mic. Roger Stone on the phone. Roger, we have just a couple of minutes left, but you are a brilliant political strategist. So let me ask you, have you noticed that Kamala Harris, or Kamala, whatever she wants to be called, has started to get a little bit more into the public eye lately? Do you think she's really considering? Because I don't really, until a couple of weeks ago, I didn't really think she was really thinking about running in 2028. But now I'm not so sure.
No, listen, from your mouth to God's ears, I hope she runs again. She was the worst presidential candidate in the history of American politics. And that laugh, that cackle, I always found it entertaining. Her word salads are legendary. She's obviously an ignominious idiot. But I think if you took a poll today, given the fact that she just spent tens of millions of dollars of mostly borrowed money, she's plunged her party deep in debt with her awful campaign. And we have to remember that the people who had the No Kings rally, they nominated a queen without anyone's votes. I mean, she was nominated for president when not a single Democrat primary voter, not a single Democrat caucus voter, not a single delegate ever nominated her. This was a sleight of hand by Barack Hussein Obama. They basically forced Joe out of the race. I think it's very interesting. A very prominent New Jersey Democrat told me on the Friday before, he said, Joe Biden will drop out at 4 o'clock on Sunday. And he says, watch the way they do it. He won't do a video. They'll release a letter. But he said the letter will not be on White House stationery. So that's very strange. Then Saturday I saw Joe saying that no matter what, I'm not dropping out. I'm definitely running. I called my friend, a very, very prominent, well-known New Jersey Democrat, and I said, do you still think Joe's dropping out? He said, 4 o'clock Sunday, and watch the signature on his letter. It'll look hinky. And it did.
Yeah, maybe the Democrats ought to try democracy. It's in their name. They might want to think about it. All right, thank you, Roger, for joining us. I'm Jake Novak. Have a great rest of your evening, everybody.
Thanks for listening to The Stone Zone with Roger Stone. You can hear The Stone Zone with Roger Stone weeknights at 8 on 77 WABC. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode, so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?